confluence of technology and personality resides a select group of individuals. Those individuals are known as technologists, and they put their thoughts on the line for you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of On the Line with Cohesity. Today, we have a really exciting topic. We are going to dive into some of the industry challenges that enterprises are facing around the risk that they're facing with cybercrime and ransomware. What we're seeing is that having data insights into threats is important for recovery, and also having the latest clean copy of data has become imperative to keeping your business up and running when an attack occurs. Also, really having an understanding of how to make sure that that data can be available no matter what happens. Also, think about this. What happens when your organization is impacted? How are your teams going to manage the recovery? They could be working 18 hours a day, 7 days a week for some unknown period of time just to recover. So a plan is necessary. We don't want that to happen to anyone. My name is Theresa Miller. I'm the Director of Technical Advocacy here at Cohesity. And today I have two very special guests from my team. We're taking this from a different perspective. Normally we have external guests, but I'm really excited to dive into this topic with them today. So I'm going to let them go ahead and introduce themselves.
Hi there, my name is Shelly Calhoun-Jones, and I'm a principal technologist on Theresa's team. I'm excited to be here. One of the things that I love is cybersecurity and talking about it. So I'm excited to be here and talk more about it with you guys.
And I'm Vic Camacho, Principal Technologist with the Technical Advocacy Group here at Cohesity, and I'm really looking forward to this. I am also very passionate about cybersecurity, data security, and this should prove to be a very interesting conversation today.
Wonderful. Let's dive in to our questions today to really get a good understanding of what we need to be thinking about. So, Shelly, I want to start with you. Can you talk a little bit about some of the current trends and challenges that enterprises are seeing around this topic?
Yeah, a lot of challenges that companies are running into is keeping abreast with the changes that are happening out on the threat landscape. You know, for a lot of us, we may follow security blogs, we may get updates from our security vendors on activity that's occurring, but the other challenge is keeping up to date with this, because for a lot of companies out there, you could be wearing multiple hats. You could be managing security solutions from different vendors. You could also be helping out other teams within your organization. So looking for ways to automate this process and keep up to date with it, and also making sure that you're educating your users on that.
That's a good point. I'll just jump in here. So you make an excellent point. Automation, I think, is going to be key, right? The manual process of searching for this, given today's threat landscape, it's very cumbersome, for one. And so if we can just focus on some of the automation pieces, being able to proactively do some threat detection, things of that nature. So there's so many. This is an ever-evolving change in this threat landscape, right? With the advent of ransomware as a service, how do you even begin to deal with that? So this is something that is, I think, on top of a lot of IT leaders' minds. And so I think this will be a good topic to have in hand here.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you both more. I mean, with the change in landscape, one of the things that I learned firsthand recently with an incident that I dealt with on a website that I have is that even like the tools that we used 18 months ago to try and protect us from cyber attacks has to change. So the choices and decisions we made in that short period of time may not be the right decisions for our security posture going forward. So in any case, that it takes me to my next question for you both. What are companies, or what are ways that companies can keep up with those security changes and best practices as a whole? Vic, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. I briefly mentioned it just a second ago, but threat intelligence, right? I think being able to detect anomalous behavior in an intelligent fashion to to understand what kind of anomalous behavior with your data is going on is key, right? And so I think about threat intelligence and how they can help in terms of getting in front of an incident or a compromise, right? Because it really is about early detection and early recovery. And so having threat intelligence to be able to give you that kind of information will go a long way in getting organizations ahead of that to try to fight ransomware before it actually has a bigger impact. Because as we know, the longer something like ransomware sits in an environment, the more opportunity it has to go out and find data that it can write over, and thereby, holding the keys to that data. Can you imagine your own keys, your own data rather? Um, and so that's kind of hard to stomach. And so getting that kind of intelligence, actionable intelligence, is key for organizations to have.
And not just that, but you can take that information, incorporate it into your documentation. For a lot of companies, you may have specific business continuity or DR procedures that you need to have in place. So you can take a lot of the information that you're pulling from that threat intelligence, you can incorporate it into your security policies. You can also update your documentation so that you can train your employees on proper security best practices. So a lot of this information feeds into other aspects of your environment to make yourself more robust and more secure.
What about training employees
That's
on
a
security? Yeah.
that's a great question. So training employees is a big one. I remember working for a company where our information security team would periodically send out emails that look legitimate but emulate phishing emails. And the idea was to kind of get into the brain of the employees whether or not to click on a risky link or click on a risky email, checking the sender or the sender where it's coming from, making sure that it's coming from a legitimate source. So a good chunk of that is training your employees because phishing is a common attack vector for a lot of threats these days. And then also just kind of going back and analyzing the behavior of your users to make sure that they're not inadvertently sharing information that should not be shared outside of the organization.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? I think it's really about creating an awareness of cybersecurity. You touch base on training the employees, and this should be. I mean, today many organizations are doing yearly cybersecurity awareness training, right? Because unless you're in this space where you are a cybersecurity engineer, administrator, or even within the vendor side, you're up to speed in many cases, so you know what to look for. But for your everyday power user, your users in the environment, it's creating awareness, a reminder that there are these cyber threats out there, and so we have to be able to keep everybody aware of that. And you mentioned also the game day exercises, right? Periodically testing your employees to see if they are clicking on things that are fictitious, right? And so that is that is key to ensure that, hey, we're looking for this kind of thing. We want to ensure that you know what to look for in terms of you know uh, compromisable links that are not legitimate. And with the social engineered phishing attacks today, they look very legitimate, right? You have to be very aware, and there are certain things that you can do to there are certain things that you can do to help avoid those kind of mistakes.
Yeah, those are all great points. And I just want to double click into the whole concept of user behavior analysis. I think having that in addition to everything else that you both talked about, where you have the ability to do log-based search and queries, so that you know what might be going on in your environment from a signal tampering perspective, exfiltration, et cetera, I think can be really, really powerful. So, Shelly, can you talk a little bit with our audience today about where data classification fits into the security strategy?
That's a great question. For a lot of organizations, you could be going through a major acquisition. You could be migrating your data out into the cloud. There could be a lot of enthusiasm within your organization for leveraging things like cloud services, which makes it even more important to understand the landscape of your data, understand how this data is being used. So for a lot of companies, they'll use data loss prevention solutions to understand how their data is being consumed, identify PII data. For a lot of cloud vendors out there, they also have their own version of data classification scans that you can use for scanning things like, let's say, an Amazon S3 bucket. But by understanding your data, you can determine what type of security policies that you need to have in place for that data. There may be I'm just going to use Amazon as an example, since I recently came from Amazon. There could be an S3 bucket within your organization that you use for sharing out public assets. But there may also be other storage repositories within your organization that could host things like social security numbers, credit card information. So you want to make sure that you're able to meet your own internal compliance and governance goals. But you also want to make sure that the data that does need to be shared does remain available. So data classification does help with limiting the attack surface. And you can also use this information to reduce false positives within your organization.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, right? I think looking at this through the lens of an IT leader, I think it's important to understand, in the case that you do become compromised, right, to understand the level of severity and the impact. And having this kind of information at hand will go a long way, because I would want to understand how or what kind of information, what kind of data, sensitive data like PII data, what got exposed potentially, right? Because if they were able to encrypt it, then the potential of data exfiltration also exists. So I would want to understand the level of impact to my organization.
Yeah, one other thing would be also even determining whether or not that data should even live there. Maybe that data needs to be moved into a different part of your environment. Maybe it shouldn't even reside at that particular location. So it really does help a lot with auditing and understanding the security health of your environment.
Yeah, as they say, you can't protect what you don't know. So this plays right into that.
Yeah, and this sounds like something you really want to have some proactive insights into as well. I know at one point in my career, I worked for a company that actually was based out of Europe. And as soon as the GDPR policies came out, we were pivoting and making sure that we could do the proper evaluation of our data to make sure that we weren't in or out of compliance with GDPR, and actually worked on remediation. So let's go ahead and pivot to tools. Organizations have a ton of security tools. It can be really important to have integrations that allow them to centralize alerts and response. Vic, could you talk about this a little bit further?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, we know that, in the IT world, you have your IT ops, your IT operations folks, but you also have your security operations folks. And oftentimes they use a completely set of different tools, right? And many of the time, they just don't understand each other's data, right? And given today's threat landscape, it just makes sense to bridge the gap between these two kinds of teams. And so using a system, whatever that system is, but using a system that integrates well with a SIM or SOAR tool will go a long way in bridging that gap, right? And again, it kind of falls in line with the whole early detection, right? We want to be we want to be able to have the tools and capabilities to integrate, and so that we can have these teams work more collaboratively together, so that they can help fight something like ransomware or even a bad actor in the environment, right? Because if they have this early indication, and the incident response teams and or security operations teams can do that from their own tool set, you're going to lessen the learning curve, right? They won't have to go into the IT operations tool set. They can just do this from their own tools, right? Do some investigation, and if deemed that it is a threat, they can recover from there. So the integration is really important, as opposed to having these two teams work separately, because the data is typically very close to the IT operations teams, right? They manage it day to day, and the incident response teams are a little bit further upstream, in terms of data, at least. And so bringing that a lot closer together will go a long way in helping fight something like ransomware or a bad actor.
Yeah, and a lot of security vendors out there and even cloud providers publish their APIs online. They publish documentation for their APIs so that you have the ability to build out your own automation scripts. Maybe you want to get a notification that goes out to a direct Slack channel, and you want to get notified of a new event that's occurring, or open up a ticket with your help desk team. So there's a lot of different ways that you can integrate and also begin the process of maybe automating certain types of security activity within your environment. Although for most companies, if you are experiencing a major incident, you definitely want to get live humans on the line.
Yeah, and this one too, in my experience, I think IT, the infrastructure teams and security teams have been trying to do this for a long time, but when I think back to like being requested of getting at my server event logs, for example, and wanting to put those in a central place. But I think things have advanced a lot, and there's actually just more mature tools that these teams can use. And now we're finally talking about how we should be working together, because at the end of the day, it's the only way we're going to stay ahead of all of the cyber threats that we're faced with as organizations. All right, so let's pivot over to some of the strategic ways that organizations are making sure data is backed up. How are organizations making sure that they can recover quickly? Shelly, can you go ahead and talk about this a little bit?
Yeah, thanks, Theresa. So for making sure that your data is backed up, I know for a lot of cloud vendors, they do have the ability to turn on features like versioning. If you are dealing with data, which could be getting changed quite rapidly, you want to make sure that you have the ability to roll back to a previous version. And not only that, but making sure that you run a full backup along with those incremental backups so that you have a full original backup that you can always reference. And, not just that, but thinking about the date that you need to restore back to. How do you find the oldest indicator of compromise? How do you know what backups are clean, what backups could potentially have suspicious files in it? And one of the challenges that I always ran into, especially when I was working with large companies, was they had so many different tools that they were using within their organization, but they didn't really have a full understanding of what tools that they may have access to. So being able to retrieve this information from a centralized source, being able to understand the timeline of what led up to the issue, so you know exactly which backup that you need to restore back to.
Those are great points, right? I think about what backup or which, from what point do you want to recover? Having that, functionality to understand what was the latest clean snapshot. That's really important. You mentioned full backups and incremental backups, but we also want to be able to have an isolated copy of your data that isn't connected to your network, right?
Yeah.
Because in the event that it's some kind of compromise like ransomware happens, then you don't want that to affect, at least one of those copies of data that you have isolated, right? So having that kind of I guess, a backup strategy in place to be able to have an isolated copy of your data, because it can and will happen. It's happened a lot in terms of ransomware and breaches, and we only know about the ones that have made its way into the news, right? Not everything gets reported, and so I imagine that it's probably worse than what we see or read about. But having that kind of uh, strategy in place so that you do have some clean copy that will not be compromised is going to be key. And by the way, that copy should also be stored in an immutable fashion, right? So that it is only read only, so that it becomes tamper resistant, so that if something were to make its way into an isolated copy of your data, that there's nothing that malicious code that we know as ransomware can do to that data. It's immutable, and that's I think that's a very important key feature to have, storing it in an immutable fashion.
All fantastic points. The only thing I want to add, just from my experiences, is make sure you're testing as well. Test your recoveries and actually have a plan that's been documented to hopefully alleviate potential serious pain if recovery is needed. All right, so we are getting close to wrapping up today. So Vic, do you want to share one of your key takeaways for our audience today?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many key takeaways that you can take from this, but if I were to share one, that would be to have a policy in place. Ensure that you are doing regular backups on a nightly basis, daily basis. Ensure that you're storing them in an immutable fashion so that they can be tamper resistant to ransomware or to anybody that's trying to write, fictitious data into it. So ensure that you're backing up frequently. Ensure that it's being stored in an immutable fashion, and ensure that you have at least one copy that is not connected to your networks. Because if you do become compromised, at least you have something that you can fall back on to recover with, right? And so that becomes your in case of emergency break glass scenario, and hopefully no one will get there, but at least you have it, and it is a set of data that you can recover from.
And to dovetail on Vic's comment related to making sure that you're running regular backups, also documenting what data within your organization needs to be backed up and how frequently. Also, just making sure that you're documenting business continuity and DR procedures so that you have the ability to fail over or restore a backup, and you know what location that you need to go back to restore those files. So documentation is huge. You can pull a lot of information, from those threat intelligence feeds. You can use this information to feed into building out more robust security policies, and you can also use that information to determine how frequently you need to be backing up your data in the process in order to go in and restore it if you do run into an event.
Wonderful. All right, so as we work to close out, I just wanted to share a couple key points as well for the audience. Thank you both, by the way, for all of your thoughts today. But what I'd like for the audience to think of as we part ways is really, when it comes to ransomware and those insider threats, they really do pose serious risk to your data and your organization, as well as their reputation. We don't want you to be in the headlines. And so with threat detection, data classification, and user activity tracking and cyber vaulting, actually Cohesity has a solution called DataHawk that can help protect your data, detect an attack, and recover quickly. On top of that, though, we also realize that security complexities can't be solved by one vendor alone. So we have our Cohesity Data Security Alliance that brings together the brightest minds and boldest solutions for comprehensive data protection and resilience for your organization. So enabling an ever more improved security posture to be most prepared for a cyber attack is possible. And with that, I want you to just take those thoughts, and we're going to go ahead and wrap up another episode of On the Line with Cohesity.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.